The courthouse of St. Augustine Parish stood as a monument to Southern justice, its white columns gleaming in the autumn sun of 1856. But on the morning of October 14th, those same halls that had witnessed verdicts and oaths became a marketplace for human flesh. The auction block had been erected in the central chamber, where judges once dispensed their rulings. Now it served a different purpose entirely. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please subscribe and like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Nathaniel Crowe had attended such sales before, though he took no pleasure in them. A man of 38 years, educated at Charleston and wealthy beyond measure, he viewed himself as a reformer among his peers. His plantation, Ashmere Hall, was known throughout Louisiana for its relative humanity. He fed his laborers well, punished sparingly, and kept families together when he could. In his own mind, he was a benevolent master in an imperfect world. History would judge him differently. The morning had proceeded, as these grim affairs always did. Men and women were paraded before the crowd, their bodies inspected like livestock, their worth calculated in the cold mathematics of muscle and fertility. Nathaniel had purchased 3 field hands already, strong men who would help rebuild the eastern acreage destroyed by last season's floods. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the courthouse floor, something changed in the atmosphere. The auctioneer, a florid man named Hastings who had conducted such sales for 20 years, grew visibly uncomfortable. He kept glancing toward the back room where the final lot waited. The assembled buyers noticed this hesitation. Conversations died. Even the most callous among them seemed to feel the shift in the air. When she finally emerged, silence fell like a shroud. She was young, perhaps 20 years of age, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the assembled crowd. Her posture was unnaturally upright for someone who had been kept in chains. Most captives stumbled, their spirits broken by the degradation of their circumstance. But this woman walked with a steady gait, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Hastings cleared his throat. His voice, usually booming with practiced enthusiasm, came out strained and thin. Lot 151, female, approximately 20 years, strong back, no visible defects. He did not mention her name. Later, Nathaniel would learn that no one knew it. Or perhaps they knew and simply refused to speak it aloud. The bidding should have been fierce. She was young, healthy, and possessed of a certain striking quality that would have made her valuable for household service. Yet no paddle rose. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking of the courthouse clock and the distant call of crows outside. Nathaniel looked around at his fellow planters. These were hard men, pragmatic and unsentimental in their business dealings. Yet each one stared fixedly at nothing, their faces carefully blank. Old Samuel Pritchard, who owned the vast Bellevue estate and who had never passed on a bargain in his life, seemed suddenly fascinated by his own boots. The auctioneer's eyes swept the room with something approaching desperation. Starting bid of $500. $500 for a prime specimen. Do I hear 500? Still nothing. The woman on the block had not moved. Her gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, beyond perhaps the very world itself. In the slanting afternoon light, Nathaniel could see marks on her wrists where manacles had rubbed the skin raw. But these were old scars, long healed. She had been bound before, many times. Something stirred in Nathaniel then, a mixture of curiosity and that dangerous sense of righteousness that had always guided his decisions. Here was a woman that others feared to touch, rejected by men who thought nothing of the traffic in human souls. In his mind, it became a moral imperative. He would save her from whatever superstitious dread held the others back. His paddle rose. The sound it made cutting through the air seemed unnaturally loud. Every head in the room turned toward him. The expressions he saw ranged from shock to pity to something darker, something that might have been recognition of a man stepping willingly into his own doom. $500, Nathaniel announced, his voice steady. Hastings looked as though he might weep with relief. 500 to Mr. Crow. Do I hear 6? Going once? Going twice? He paused, perhaps hoping even then that someone would intervene. Sold to Nathaniel Crow of Ashmere Hall. The gavel fell with the finality of a coffin nail being driven home. As the crowd dispersed with unseemly haste, Nathaniel approached the auction block to claim his purchase. Up close, he could see that her eyes were not brown, as he had first thought, but a deep amber color that seemed to catch and hold the light. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and he felt something cold move through his chest. It was not fear, he told himself, simply the chill of the autumn air. "What is your name?" he asked. She did not answer. Her lips remained sealed, though he could see intelligence burning behind those strange eyes. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken knowledge. Hastings approached with the bill of sale, his hands trembling slightly as he offered the paper. "She comes with one stipulation, Mr. Crow." "What stipulation?" "She has a trunk, a small sealed trunk that came with her from her previous situation. She won't move without it, won't speak, won't eat, just sits and stares at it until it's given to her." Nathaniel frowned. "What's inside?" "No one knows. It's sealed with wax and twine. The previous owner tried to open it once." Hastings paused, his face going pale at the memory. He burned to death that very night, locked himself in his study and set it ablaze. Some say it was suicide. Others say the door was locked from the outside. "Superstitious nonsense," Nathaniel declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Hastings agreed, "but you'll honor the stipulation, won't you? Otherwise you'll get no cooperation from her at all." Nathaniel looked at the woman again. She had not moved, had not reacted to any part of their conversation. It was as though she existed in a separate realm, connected to this world only by the thinnest of threads. "Very well, bring the trunk to my carriage." The journey back to Ashmere Hall took 3 hours along roads that wound through dense cypress swamps and fields of dying sugarcane. Nathaniel's other purchases rode in the wagon behind, but he had placed the woman called Lot 151 in his own carriage. The trunk sat beside her, a thing of dark wood bound with iron and sealed with red wax that had been pressed with a symbol Nathaniel did not recognize. She held it throughout the journey, her fingers tracing patterns on its surface. And though Nathaniel tried to engage her in conversation, she remained as silent as stone. Ashmere Hall rose from the marshland like a dream of better days. The main house was a testament to colonial grandeur, with its white columns and wraparound galleries, but closer inspection revealed the rot at its edges, the way the paint peeled like diseased skin, the manner in which certain windows seemed darker than they should be, as though light itself avoided them. Nathaniel's wife, Margaret, waited on the front steps. She was a thin woman of 35, worn down by the climate and the isolation of plantation life. When she saw the woman emerging from the carriage, trunk clutched tightly to her chest, Margaret's face went rigid with an emotion Nathaniel could not immediately identify. "Who is this?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. "A new housemaid. I purchased her at auction today." "You purchased a housemaid without consulting me?" Margaret descended the steps, her eyes never leaving the silent woman. "There's something wrong with her. Can't you see it? something wrong in her very essence. "Margaret, please don't succumb to the same ignorant fears as those men at the courthouse. She's simply traumatized by her circumstances." But even as he spoke, Nathaniel felt the weight of doubt. His wife was not given to hysteria or superstition. She ran the household with practical efficiency and had never objected to any of his purchases before. Yet now she stood frozen, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The woman who was Lot 151 walked past them both without acknowledgement, moving toward the house as though she already knew its layout. The servants who had gathered to see the new arrivals parted before her like water before the prow of a ship. Old Samuel, the head butler who had served the Crow family for 40 years, made the sign of the cross as she passed. His lips moved in silent prayer. Nathaniel assigned her quarters in the small building behind the main house, where the trusted house servants lived. It was a room of modest comfort, far superior to the conditions in the field quarters. He had the trunk placed inside as she had requested, watching as she set it carefully in the corner and then sat before it, her hands folded in her lap. "You'll be expected to help with household duties," he explained. "Cleaning, mending, assisting with meals. Margaret will instruct you in your tasks tomorrow. For tonight, rest and recover from the journey." She gave no indication that she heard him. Her gaze remained fixed on the trunk. That night, as Nathaniel lay beside his wife in their bed, he heard singing. It came from across the yard, from the servant quarters where he had placed the woman. The melody was haunting, carried on a voice that seemed too powerful to emanate from one throat alone. The words were not English nor French nor any of the African dialects he had heard the field hands speak. It was something older, something that predated the nations and languages he knew. Margaret clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Send her away, tomorrow. Please, Nathaniel, send her back." "Back where? To the auction block? To be rejected again and again until she's sold to someone far less kind than I? You know I cannot do that." "Then you doom us all." The singing continued until dawn, when it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Nathaniel rose with the sun, exhausted and troubled by dreams he could not quite remember. When he looked out the window toward the servant quarters, he saw that every door stood open, every window unshuttered. The other servants had fled in the night, clustering together in the main house, unwilling to remain near the woman who sang in tongues. But it was what he saw in the yard that truly chilled him. The family dog, a hunting hound named Caesar, who had been healthy and vital the day before, lay dead at the foot of the woman's door. The animal's eyes were wide open, staring up at nothing. Its mouth was frozen in a silent howl. And though the morning sun illuminated everything with golden light, the shadow of the woman's doorway seemed darker than it should be, as though it led not into a simple room, but into depths unfathomable. Nathaniel descended the stairs and crossed the yard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt beside the dog and placed his hand on its side. The body was cold, far colder than it should have been after just a few hours of death. There were no marks of violence, no sign of poison or injury. The creature had simply died, terror frozen on its face for eternity. Behind him he heard Margaret's voice from the gallery, thin and breaking. "Now, do you believe?" He did not answer because he did not know what he believed. But as he stood and looked toward the closed door of the woman's quarters, he felt the first true stirrings of fear, not the rational fear of financial loss or social embarrassment, but something more primal, something that whispered in the oldest parts of his brain that he had brought into his home not a person, but a reckoning. The death of the dog marked the beginning of what Nathaniel would later think of as the unraveling. It started with small things, easily dismissed by a rational mind. Mirrors in the house seemed to reflect shadows that had no source. Doors that were firmly latched would be found standing open in the morning. The servants whispered among themselves, their conversations dying the moment Nathaniel entered a room. But Margaret's condition could not be so easily dismissed. Within 3 days of the woman's arrival, his wife began to waste away. She could not eat, could not sleep. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, and her hands developed a constant tremor. She insisted that she heard voices at night, dozens of them, speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. When Nathaniel held her, he could feel her heartbeat racing like that of a trapped bird. The doctor, summoned from town, could find no physical ailment. He prescribed laudanum and rest, but the medicines brought no relief. If anything, they seemed to make matters worse. Under the influence of the drug, Margaret's nightmares became so violent that Nathaniel had to restrain her to prevent her from harming herself. She spoke of faces pressed against the windows, their features melted and wrong. She described the smell of burning sugarcane that filled her room each night, though Nathaniel could detect no such odor. On the 5th day, driven by desperation and a growing sense that he had made a terrible mistake, Nathaniel decided to investigate. He sent word to the courthouse requesting all records pertaining to Lot 151. What he received 3 days later only deepened the mystery. The documents arrived in a water-stained portfolio delivered by a clerk, who seemed eager to be rid of them. Nathaniel spread them across his desk in the study and began to read by lamplight. What he found made no sense according to any rational understanding of the world. The woman had been sold 17 times in the past 3 years. 17 times. Each sale was recorded in meticulous detail, along with the name of the buyer and the price paid. But there was something wrong with the sequence. Many of the buyers' names had been scratched out, rendered illegible by what appeared to be burns in the paper itself. Others were marked with annotations in different hands: deceased, estate liquidated, location unknown. Nathaniel traced the ownership backwards through time. The most recent seller before himself had been a widow named Constance Beaumont, who had owned a small farm near Baton Rouge. She had purchased the woman in February of 1856 and resold her in September of the same year. The notation beside her name read, "Committed to asylum, October." Before Madame Beaumont, the woman had belonged to a merchant named Thaddeus Cole, who had kept her for only 3 weeks before demanding the sale be reversed. His petition to the court contained a single line that Nathaniel read 3 times, his hands growing colder with each reading. "She does not sleep, does not speak, does not perform any labor. She only sits and watches, and in her watching, my household has come undone." But it was when Nathaniel traced the ownership back to its origin that the true horror began to reveal itself. The woman had first appeared in the records in the spring of 1853, listed not as a purchase but as salvage. She had been found wandering the ruins of a plantation called Thornwood, which had burned to the ground 3 weeks earlier. The fire had killed 47 people, including the owner, his family, and every enslaved person on the property. Every person except her. The investigating marshal's report was attached to the bill of salvage. Nathaniel read it with a growing sense of dread that seemed to press down on him like a physical weight. The marshal described finding the woman sitting in the center of the burned plantation house, surrounded by ash and collapsed timbers, completely unharmed. She had not responded to questions. She had not resisted when they took her away. She had simply clutched a small trunk and allowed herself to be led to the wagon. The marshal noted something else, something that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. The fire had started simultaneously in 17 different locations throughout the plantation. It was not an accident. It could not have been an accident. But the woman had been found locked in the house, her room bolted from the outside. There was no way she could have set the fires. Yet in his report, the marshal had written one final observation, underlined 3 times. In all my years of investigating fires, I have never seen one that burned with such completeness. The bodies were not merely killed, but rendered to ash, as though consumed by a heat far beyond what wood or lamp oil could produce. And at the center of each point of origin, I found the same symbol burned into the floor, a circle containing what appears to be a tree with roots that extend in all directions. The woman bears this same symbol tattooed on her left shoulder. Nathaniel set down the papers and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought of the trunk in the woman's room, sealed and never opened. He thought of the singing in an unknown language. He thought of his wife's deteriorating condition and the dog lying dead with terror frozen in its eyes. A rational man, he had always prided himself on his education and his rejection of superstition, but rationality itself seemed insufficient to explain what he had uncovered. There were forces at work here that defied conventional understanding, patterns that suggested not coincidence but purpose. He resolved to confront the woman, to demand answers. But first, he needed more information. He sent letters to several of the previous owners whose addresses he had been able to determine. Most went unanswered. But one reply came, delivered 10 days later, in a hand so shaky that the words were barely legible. It was from a man named Harrison Webb, who had owned the woman for 2 months in the summer of 1854. His letter was brief and disturbing. "Sir, I beg you to destroy your purchase and burn her remains, though I fear even that will not end what she carries. She is not human, though she wears human form. She is a vessel for something older and darker than our simple understanding can encompass. Each night she stood at my window and sang, and in her singing I heard the voices of every sin I had ever committed. My fields went barren, my livestock died, my children fell ill with fevers that no medicine could touch. When I finally returned her to market, my family recovered within days, but the damage was done. My wife never looked at me the same way again. She knew what I was, you see. The woman had revealed it somehow, had pulled forth every cruelty and every lie and held them up to the light. We divorced within the year. I live alone now, and I am glad for it, for I am not fit company for decent people. Whatever you paid for her, it was too much. May God have mercy on your soul." The letter was signed and dated from an address in Mobile. Nathaniel immediately penned a response, seeking clarification, more details, anything that might help him understand what he faced. The letter was returned 3 weeks later, marked "Addressee deceased." As autumn deepened into winter, the atmosphere at Ashmere Hall grew more oppressive. The woman remained in her quarters, emerging only occasionally to walk the property. She needed no food, or if she ate, no one saw her do so. She spoke to no one, acknowledged no one, but her presence seemed to permeate everything, like smoke seeping under doors and through walls. The workers in the fields began to whisper about sounds coming from the earth itself. They claimed that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the air hung heavy with moisture, they could hear voices rising from the soil, pleading voices, accusing voices, the songs of the dead. Nathaniel dismissed these claims as hysteria until one night when he heard it himself. He had been unable to sleep, troubled by Margaret's declining state, and had gone to walk the grounds near midnight. As he approached the eastern fields, those acres that had been worked by enslaved hands for 3 generations, he heard it. A low murmur, like dozens of people speaking at once just below the threshold of individual understanding. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind and rising from the earth. He stood frozen in the darkness, listening, and though he could not make out individual words, he understood the tone. It was accusation, it was grief, It was the sound of suffering that had never been acknowledged, pain that had never been answered. When he turned to flee back to the house, he saw her standing at the edge of the field. The woman, Lot 151. She was ankle-deep in the pond that bordered the eastern acreage, her white shift glowing in the starlight. Her arms were raised, palms up, as though she were receiving something from the sky above or offering something to the water below, and the murmuring grew louder. Nathaniel ran. He ran like a child, fleeing nightmares, abandoning all dignity and reason. He did not stop until he reached the house and bolted the door behind him. When he finally dared to look out the window towards the pond, the woman was gone. But the murmuring continued until dawn, when it faded with the coming of light. The next morning, Nathaniel made a decision. He would search the woman's quarters while she walked the grounds. He would open that damned trunk and discover what secret it held. Whatever consequences followed could be no worse than this slow dissolution of his household and his sanity. He waited until he saw her leave, moving with that same unhurried grace toward the fields. Then he took a hammer and chisel from the tool shed and made his way to her room. His hands shook as he worked at the trunk's seals, breaking the wax and cutting the twine. The lock itself was rusted shut, and he had to use the chisel to pry it open. When the lid finally gave way, he staggered back, dropping his tools. The smell that rose from within was overwhelming, earth and smoke and something else, something organic and ancient. Inside the trunk, arranged with careful precision, were objects that made no sense and yet suggested a terrible purpose. There were shackles, rusted and stained, lengths of chain, a whip with 9 tails, its leather cracked and brown with old blood. But these were not the most disturbing contents. Beneath them lay bundles of hair, some gray, some dark, some the color of corn silk. Children's hair, and there were bones, small ones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, and soil, dark soil that seemed to writhe in the light as though it were alive. But it was the parchment that truly destroyed him, a single sheet of paper, brown with age, covered in names written in ash. Hundreds of names. Thousands. The handwriting changed throughout, suggesting many different authors over many years. Some names he recognized, people who had belonged to his father, his grandfather. Others were unknown to him, but all shared one thing in common. They were the dead, the lost, the forgotten. Every person who had suffered and died on this land, their names preserved in ash and bound in this terrible reliquary. And at the bottom of the list, in fresh ash that smudged beneath his trembling fingers, were 2 names recently added: Margaret Crow, Nathaniel Crow. He heard her voice then, speaking for the first time since he had brought her to Ashmere Hall. It came from the doorway behind him, calm and resonant with terrible authority. You bought what you thought was flesh. You purchased the weight of your house's sins. I am not what was sold. I am what was owed. Nathaniel turned slowly, the parchment still clutched in his hands, the names of the dead written in ash, smudging against his fingers. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the harsh light of midday, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a woman, not as property, not as anything human at all. She was a void in the shape of a person, an absence that somehow existed, a wound in the fabric of the world that had learned to walk and speak. Her eyes, those strange amber eyes, held no malice. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing. There was no anger in them, no hatred, only an infinite patience and a knowledge so deep it seemed to stretch back beyond memory, beyond history, into the dark foundations upon which civilization had been built. "What are you?" Nathaniel whispered, and was ashamed at how his voice broke. She entered the room, and though her movements were fluid and natural, he felt as though something vast had entered, something that did not quite fit within the dimensions of the physical space. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. "I am testament," she said. Her voice carried the weight of many voices, echoes upon echoes. "I am the ledger that cannot be burned. I am the debt that compounds across generations. I am what remains when everything else has been stripped away." Nathaniel looked down at the parchment, at the names written in ash. These people, they died here, on this land. They died in chains. They died in fields. They died in childbed and under the lash and by their own hands, when despair became unbearable. They died unnamed and unmourned, their bodies put into the ground like seeds, their suffering dismissed as the natural order of things. "I didn't kill them, my Father. You tilled the fields they cleared. You lived in the house they built. You drank water from wells they dug while their own throats burned with thirst. You profited from their labor and called yourself merciful because you did not add to their torment." She moved closer, and he could smell smoke and earth and something underneath, something like old blood. "You are what you inherit, Nathaniel Crow. Every coin in your pocket, every moment of comfort, every presumption of your place in the world, all of it built on their backs, their blood, their stolen years. I tried to be different, better than the others." "Better?" The word seemed to echo in the small room, resonating with bitter irony. "You kept families together when it suited your economics. You fed them adequately because healthy slaves work harder. You minimized the lash because modern agricultural journals suggested it improved productivity. Your kindness was calculation. Your mercy was investment. And you expected gratitude for not being a monster." Nathaniel felt something breaking inside him, a foundation crumbling. "Then what would you have had me do? Free them. I would be ruined. The other planters would—" "Yes," she interrupted. "You would be ruined. You would lose your wealth, your status, your comfort. You would face precisely the kind of loss and suffering that millions have faced, so that you could avoid facing it yourself. That is the truth you cannot bear to see, that your entire way of life requires their agony, that your gentility is purchased with their degradation, that there is no innocent way to be what you are." She gestured to the trunk, to its terrible contents. "Do you know what these are? Truly?" Nathaniel shook his head, unable to speak. "These are what remains when everything else is taken, the shackles that bound them, the hair cut from children who were sold away from their mothers, the bones of those who died young, worked to death or broken by despair, and this soil." She reached into the trunk and lifted a handful of the dark earth. "This is from the fields where they bled, where they wept, where they prayed to gods who seemed not to hear them. This soil remembers. It holds their essence, their suffering crystallized into the very elements." The earth in her hand seemed to move, to pulse with a life of its own. Nathaniel watched in horror as it began to smoke, wisps of gray-black vapor rising from her palm. "I was not born," she continued, her voice growing deeper, more resonant. "I was made, formed from the collective will of thousands of souls who died without justice, without acknowledgement, without even the dignity of having their humanity recognized. They could not rest. They could not forgive. They could not forget. And so they made me a vessel, a vehicle, a means by which the debt could be collected." The smoke rising from the soil began to take shapes, vague human forms that writhed and reached. Nathaniel stumbled backward until his back hit the wall, but there was nowhere to flee. "Every plantation that bought me burned," she said. "Every owner who claimed possession of me lost everything, not because I willed it so, but because I am the reckoning. I am the moment when denial meets reality. I am the price finally coming due." "Please," Nathaniel begged. though he did not know what he was begging for. "My wife, she's innocent in this. She didn't. She wore dresses sewn by hands she never thanked. She ate food prepared by women she never saw as fully human. She gave orders and expected obedience and called it household management. She is as guilty as you, Nathaniel. There is no innocence in prosperity built on suffering. There is only willful blindness." The room seemed to be growing darker, though the sun still shone outside. Shadows gathered in the corners, and in those shadows, Nathaniel began to see them. Faces, hundreds of faces, thousands, men and women, and children, their expressions not of anger, but of unbearable sadness. They watched him with eyes that held all the years of their stolen lives, all the dreams they had been forced to abandon, all the love they had given despite receiving none in return. "This is what you built your world upon," she said, and now her voice was many voices, a chorus of the dead speaking through her. "This is what you refused to see. This is what you told yourself did not matter, was not real, was simply the way things had to be. But we were real, we mattered, and we remember." Nathaniel sank to his knees, the weight of what he saw pressing him down. Tears streamed down his face, but they brought no relief. He understood now, with terrible clarity, that there was no absolution possible, no way to make amends, no act of contrition that could balance the scales. "The fire will come tonight," she told him. "It always comes. It is not my choice or my will. It is simply what happens when the weight of accumulated sin becomes too great for the physical world to contain. The land itself rejects what has been built upon it. The very air ignites with suppressed truth." "Will it hurt?" he asked, and hated himself for asking. "Yes," she said simply, "but not as much as the lives you profited from. Not as much as the slow burning of hope, extinguished year after year. Not as much as the knowledge that you would never be free, never be fully human in the eyes of those who claimed ownership of your flesh." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One of the previous owners, a woman named Constance Beaumont, tried to free me. She brought papers to the courthouse declaring manumission. She thought if she gave me freedom, the haunting would stop." "What happened?" Nathaniel asked, though he already knew the answer would not bring comfort. "The papers burned before she could sign them, spontaneously combusted in her hand, because you cannot free what was never enslaved. I am not bound by human law or human will. I am bound by blood and suffering and the terrible mathematics of injustice. I will walk from plantation to plantation until every acre that held slaves has burned, until every house built with their labor has fallen, until the land itself is cleansed." "How long?" Nathaniel asked. "How long will you walk?" "As long as it takes," she said. "As long as there are places that refuse to remember, as long as there are fortunes built on bones, as long as there are people who profit from evil and call it prosperity." She left him then, kneeling in the ruins of his certainty, surrounded by the names of the dead. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of the plantation continuing, servants going about their duties, livestock calling from the pens, the wind moving through the trees. But it all seemed distant now, unreal, like a dream he was about to wake from. He thought of Margaret lying in their bed, wasting away under the weight of visions she could not escape. He thought of his children, if they had been blessed with children, inheriting not just his wealth but his guilt. He thought of his father and grandfather, building this empire of cotton and sugarcane, never once questioning the foundation it rested upon. As afternoon faded toward evening, Nathaniel remained in that small room, surrounded by evidence of atrocities he had known about but never truly acknowledged. The shackles, the whip, the hair and bones, the names written in ash, all of it real, all of it true, all of it the price of his comfort. When he finally rose and walked back to the main house, the sun was setting in a sky the color of blood and fire. Margaret was standing on the gallery, her face calm for the first time in weeks. She looked at him and smiled, but it was not a happy expression. It was the smile of someone who has accepted the inevitable. "You understand now," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he replied. "Will you try to run?" He shook his head. "Where would we go?" She said it herself. "The debt follows us. It is us. There is no escape from what we are." They stood together as the sun completed its descent, watching shadows stretch across the land their family had claimed and worked and profited from for 3 generations. In the distance, Nathaniel saw her standing at the edge of the fields, her arms raised once again, her voice lifted in that strange, ancient song. And from the earth itself, from the soil that held the bones and blood of thousands, came an answering song. The voices of the dead, no longer murmuring but singing openly, joyfully, the way prisoners sing when the cell door finally opens. The first flames appeared at the eastern edge of the property, exactly where Nathaniel's grandfather had built the original slave quarters. Then more fires bloomed throughout the plantation, 17 separate blazes, just as had happened at Thornwood, appearing simultaneously in a pattern that could not be natural. But Nathaniel did not try to fight them. Margaret did not scream or flee. They stood together on the gallery and watched as the reckoning approached, as the debt came due, as the land itself rose up in rejection of everything they had built upon it. The heat, when it reached them, was indeed terrible. But Nathaniel found himself thinking, as the flames climbed the columns and the smoke filled his lungs, that she had been right. It hurt, yes, but not as much as a lifetime of knowing you would never be free. Not as much as watching your children sold away. Not as much as dying unnamed and unmourned, your suffering dismissed as simply the way things had to be. In his final moments, as the fire consumed Ashmere Hall and everything it represented, Nathaniel Crowe understood the true meaning of justice. It was not fair, it was not merciful, it was not proportionate to individual guilt. It was simply the universe correcting itself. The scales finally balancing, the debt finally paid, and through the flames he saw her walking away, untouched, the trunk clutched to her chest, ready to carry her burden of memory and reckoning to the next plantation, and the next, and the next. The fire that consumed Ashmere Hall burned for 3 days. When it finally exhausted itself, nothing remained but ash and the twisted skeletons of what had once been grand columns. The heat had been so intense that stone cracked and iron melted into pools of slag. Even the ground itself was scorched black, as though the earth had been marked by something far hotter than any natural fire could produce. The neighboring planters arrived too late to help. They claimed they had seen the flames, had hitched their wagons and ridden through the night. But privately they admitted to each other that they had hesitated. Something about the quality of that fire, the color of the smoke, had warned them away. It had not looked like a normal blaze. It had looked like judgment itself made visible. No bodies were ever found. The authorities searched through the ruins for weeks, sifting through ash and debris, but discovered nothing that could definitively be identified as human remains. The heat had been too complete, too absolute. Nathaniel and Margaret Crowe had simply ceased to exist in any material sense. The land itself seemed poisoned by what had occurred. When spring came, nothing would grow in the fields that had once produced abundant harvests of sugarcane. Farmers tried to work the soil, but their plows broke against ground that had become hard as stone. Seeds that were planted rotted in the earth before they could germinate. Wells that had provided clear water for generations turned brackish and foul, their contents smelling of smoke and something else, something organic and wrong. Within a year, the property was abandoned entirely. Birds would not nest in the trees. Deer avoided the area. Even insects seemed to sense that something unnatural lingered there. The few slaves who had survived, those who had been working in distant fields when the fire started, refused to ever set foot on the grounds again. They spoke of hearing voices in the night, songs in languages that predated cotton and Christianity, the sound of chains that no longer bound anyone yet somehow still echoed. A consortium of investors purchased the land in 1859, hoping to rehabilitate it and restore productivity. They brought in new soil, dug new wells, imported laborers from other states who had no knowledge of Ashmere Hall's history. For 6 months they worked diligently, clearing the rubble and laying foundations for new structures. Then the children began to fall ill. First one, then another, then 5 more. They developed fevers that no medicine could touch, fevers that made them see things that should not exist. They spoke of a woman who stood at the foot of their beds at night, singing in a voice that carried the weight of thousands. They described her eyes, amber-colored and ancient, looking at them, with neither malice nor mercy, only terrible knowledge. The project was abandoned before the year ended. The investors cut their losses and fled. The land was left to return to wilderness, which it did with unnatural speed. Within 3 years, the site of Ashmere Hall was completely overgrown, reclaimed by the marsh and the forest as though civilization had never touched it. But the stories persisted. Travelers passing through the area at night reported seeing fires in the distance, flames that appeared and disappeared without explanation. They heard singing that seemed to rise from the earth itself, and some claimed to see her, a woman walking along the roads at midnight, carrying a small trunk, her pace unhurried and eternal. The other plantations in the parish grew nervous. Owners who had once proudly displayed their wealth and status began to speak in hushed tones about the past, about the foundations of their prosperity. Some freed their slaves, though they claimed it was for economic reasons, not moral ones. Others hired priests to bless their fields, ministers to pray over their homes. But they all knew, though they would not speak it aloud, that blessing and prayer were insufficient shields against what walked the night. In 1862, during the chaos of war, a Union officer named Captain James Whitmore led his company through the area. His orders were to requisition supplies and disrupt Confederate infrastructure. When his men approached the ruins of Ashmere Hall, their horses refused to proceed. The animals reared and whinnied in terror, rolling their eyes until the whites showed. Whitmore dismounted and approached on foot. He was a practical man from Massachusetts, educated at Yale, skeptical of Southern superstition. But when he reached the edge of the burned grounds, he stopped. The air felt different there, heavier, charged with something he could not name, and though it was mid-afternoon with the sun blazing overhead, the shadows seemed too deep, too dark. His sergeant, a man named O'Brien, who had grown up hearing Irish tales of the unseelie folk, grabbed Whitmore's arm. "Sir, we should not be here. This is cursed ground." "There's no such thing as curses," Whitmore replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then explain why nothing grows here, sir. Explain why the very air tastes of ash 4 years after the fire. Explain why every man in the company feels the urge to flee." Whitmore could not explain these things. As a scientist and a rationalist, he knew there should be explanations, soil contamination perhaps, or residual chemicals from the fire, but he also knew what his own senses told him. This place was wrong. Not just abandoned or destroyed, but fundamentally altered in some way that defied natural law. They left without taking supplies or burning anything further. In his official report, Whitmore wrote only that the site offered no tactical value. But in his private journal, discovered years after his death, he wrote something more honest. "I have seen men die in battle, seen the worst that war can bring, but I have never felt evil until today. That plantation, or what remains of it, is not simply empty. It is actively hostile to human presence. Something lingers there, something that makes the hair stand on the back of your neck and your bowels go loose with instinctive terror. The men say a woman haunts the ruins, but I think it is something deeper than ghosts. I think the land itself has memory, and it remembers what was done upon it." In the decades that followed the war, as Reconstruction reshaped the South and the slave economy crumbled, other plantations began to experience similar phenomena. Fires with no apparent source, fields that refused to produce crops, children seeing visions of a woman who walked without sound and sang without joy. Always the same pattern, always 17 separate points of ignition, always the complete destruction of not just the buildings, but the very possibility of prosperity on that land. A historian named Rebecca Thornhill attempted to document these incidents in 1903. She spent 2 years traveling through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, interviewing survivors and descendants, collecting stories that had been passed down through families both white and black. Her findings were compiled in a manuscript titled The Walking Testament, an investigation into post-slavery phenomena. The manuscript was never published. 3 different publishers rejected it, citing its sensationalistic nature and lack of scientific credibility. But Thornhill was undeterred. In her introduction, she wrote, "I have come to believe that we are witnessing something that exists outside the boundaries of normal historical analysis. These are not ghost stories in the traditional sense. They are not tales of individual spirits seeking personal revenge. Rather, they suggest the existence of something collective, something formed from the accumulated trauma of millions. The woman described in these accounts is always the same, young, silent, carrying a trunk, possessing eyes that seem to see through time itself. She is reported at dozens of locations, sometimes simultaneously, which suggests she is not a single entity, but rather a manifestation of something larger. A reckoning, perhaps, a settling of accounts that cannot be dismissed or rationalized away." Thornhill's manuscript sat in university archives for decades, largely forgotten. But in 1968, during the height of the civil rights movement, a graduate student named Marcus Williams rediscovered it. He was researching the economic impact of slavery on Southern agricultural development and stumbled upon Thornhill's work quite by accident. What struck Williams was not the supernatural elements, which he initially dismissed as folklore, but the economic data embedded in the accounts. Every plantation that experienced these phenomena had been particularly prosperous under the slave system. Every owner who lost their property had been documented as especially cruel or especially successful, or both. It was as though something was targeting not just any complicity in slavery, but the most egregious examples of profit derived from suffering. Williams attempted to publish his analysis, but found himself facing the same resistance that Thornhill had encountered. His advisors suggested he was damaging his academic credibility by engaging with superstition. His peers accused him of sensationalism. But Williams persisted because he had discovered something that troubled him deeply. The pattern was not finished. It was still continuing. Modern incidents were harder to document and easier to dismiss. A fire at a historic plantation house in 1973 attributed to faulty wiring. The mysterious illness that struck the children of a family who had converted a former slave quarters into a boutique hotel in 1987. The businessman who purchased ancestral plantation land for development in 1995 and went bankrupt within a year when every construction project was plagued by inexplicable failures. In each case, witnesses reported the same details if you knew how to ask. A woman seen walking the property at night, singing in an unknown language, eyes that reflected light strangely, and always, somewhere on the premises, evidence of that symbol, a circle containing a tree with roots extending in all directions, burned or carved into wood, appearing where it should not be. Williams compiled his findings and self-published them in 1998, under the title Unfinished Business: The Economic and Supernatural Legacy of American Slavery. The book sold poorly and was largely ignored by mainstream academia, but it found an audience among those who had experienced the phenomena directly, those who had inherited plantations or purchased historic properties and discovered that some debts cannot be discharged through legal transactions. One of Williams's correspondents was a man named Thomas Crow, great-great-grandson of Nathaniel. He had grown up knowing only vague family stories about a tragic fire that destroyed Ashmere Hall. But when he began researching his genealogy in 2006, he uncovered documents that his family had tried to suppress for generations. Letters, journals, bills of sale, the same water-stained portfolio that Nathaniel had once studied. And in reading them, Thomas began to understand the true nature of his inheritance, not just wealth, but guilt, not just property, but debt. He traveled to Louisiana to see the site of Ashmere Hall, which was now part of a nature preserve. The rangers warned him that the area was considered unstable, that sinkholes appeared without warning, that visitors sometimes became disoriented and lost despite clear trails. But Thomas persisted. When he reached the ruins, now barely visible beneath decades of growth, he felt it immediately. The same presence that his ancestor had felt, the same weight, the same sense of being observed by something that existed outside normal categories of living and dead. He stood in what had once been the main house's foundation and spoke aloud, feeling foolish but compelled. "I'm sorry for what they did, for what my family profited from. I know it's not enough. I know sorry means nothing, but I wanted to say it anyway." The forest went silent. No birds, no insects, no wind, just profound stillness. And then he saw her, standing at the edge of the clearing, the woman from the stories. Lot 151. She looked exactly as described in the historical accounts, young, dressed in a simple white shift, holding a small trunk. Her amber eyes met his across the decades and the distance. She did not speak. She did not need to. Thomas understood, in that moment of connection, what she represented. Not vengeance, but memory. Not hatred, but acknowledgement. She was the receipt for a transaction that had never been completed, the record of debts that had never been paid. "I'll tell them," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I'll make sure people know the real story, all of it." She tilted her head slightly, as though considering his offer. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into shadows that should not have been so deep in broad daylight. Thomas kept his promise. He donated the family's remaining wealth to organizations working for racial justice and historical truth. He published every document, every letter, every piece of evidence of his family's participation in slavery. He gave lectures and interviews using his own shame as a teaching tool. But he knew as he did this work that it was insufficient. How could it not be? How do you repay hundreds of years of stolen labor? How do you compensate for lives never lived, families never formed, dreams never realized? How do you balance those scales? The answer, of course, is that you cannot. Some debts are too large to repay, some evils too profound to make right. All you can do is acknowledge them, remember them, ensure they are not forgotten or minimized or explained away as simply the unfortunate circumstances of their time. In 2023, a team of archaeologists received permission to conduct an excavation at the Ashmere Hall site. They hoped to document the lives of enslaved people through material culture, personal items, living spaces, burial grounds. What they found was more extensive than expected. Beneath the foundation of the main house, they discovered a mass grave. Hundreds of individuals buried without ceremony, their remains intermingled and incomplete. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, noted in her report that the burial appeared deliberately disrespectful. Bodies stacked without regard for dignity, covered with lime to speed decomposition, marked only by that recurring symbol, burned into wooden posts. But what disturbed the team most was that the excavation could not be completed. Equipment malfunctioned constantly, workers became ill with mysterious ailments, and at night, security cameras recorded something moving through the site. A figure that appeared on film as a bright spot, as though the camera was capturing not reflected light, but some kind of energy emission. The project was suspended. The site was reburied. In her final report, Dr. Chen included a note that was later removed by the university administration, but which circulated privately among her colleagues. I have been an archaeologist for 20 years. I have excavated sites of great tragedy, battlefields, plague pits, genocide locations, but I have never experienced what occurred at Ashmere Hall. This is not merely a burial ground. It is something active, something ongoing. The past is not past there. It is present and demanding recognition. We owe it to these individuals to acknowledge what happened. But we must also acknowledge that some wounds do not heal simply because time passes. Some violations are so profound that they alter the fabric of reality itself. Today, the site of Ashmere Hall remains undeveloped and largely unvisited. Local residents avoid it. The few who venture there report the same experiences, the sense of being watched, the sound of singing, the smell of smoke on windless days. And some, though they are reluctant to admit it publicly, claim to see her still, walking the grounds at dusk, standing at the edge of the forest, watching the road as though waiting for something, waiting perhaps for the debt to finally be acknowledged in full, for the names in ash to be spoken aloud, for the truth of what was built and how it was built to be faced without flinching or excuses. But America remains a nation uneasy with such truths. We prefer to believe that the past is past, that old sins can be buried and forgotten, that prosperity is proof of virtue rather than sometimes the fruit of atrocity. We build museums and monuments while still clutching the wealth those atrocities generated. We say the right words while refusing to follow them to their logical conclusions. And so she walks still, if the stories are true, carrying her trunk of evidence, singing her songs in languages we have tried to forget, moving from place to place where the soil remembers what the history books minimize. She is not ghost or demon, not spirit or symbol. She is something more troubling than any of those categories could contain. She is the debt made manifest, the past refusing to remain past, the reckoning that arrives not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow, inexorable accumulation of consequence. Evil Nathaniel Crow understood in his final moments is not what men summon from hell, but what they build into the earth and call prosperity. It is not the dramatic act of malice, but the systematic cruelty normalized into economic policy. It is not the monster lurking in shadows, but the respectable man sitting in the parlor, tallying his profits and calling himself civilized. And the woman who was Lot 151, who was salvaged from the ashes of Thornwood, who was bought and sold 17 times, who walked untouched through flames. She is the reminder that some accounts cannot be closed. Some sins do not fade with time. Some debts accumulate interest across generations until the weight of them becomes unbearable. Historians debate whether she was real or merely legend, whether the incidents attributed to her can be explained through natural causes and coincidence. But those who have stood on the grounds of Ashmere Hall, who have felt that presence and heard that singing, they know something that cannot be fully captured in academic analysis. They know that guilt has weight, that suffering leaves marks, that the earth itself keeps records more accurate than any human accounting. And they know that somewhere on a road in the south, a woman walks still, carrying her trunk, singing her songs, moving toward the next plantation, the next estate, the next monument to prosperity built on bones. She does not hurry, she does not rest. She simply continues, eternal and patient, as the debt she represents. For debt, unlike the human beings who incur it, never dies. It simply passes on, compounding and accumulating, waiting for the day when it can no longer be ignored, when the bill comes due, when the reckoning finally arrives. And when that day comes, when the flames finally rise, we cannot say we were not warned. The signs have been there all along, written in ash, sung in strange languages, carried in a sealed trunk by a woman who refuses to be forgotten. Some call her ghost, some call her myth, some call her justice. But perhaps the truest name is simpler than any of these. She is memory. And memory, unlike the empires built on suffering, does not burn.